The airport was a swirling mass of movement. People rushing past, voices blending into an indistinct hum, and the steady echo of announcements reminding travelers to check their gates. Overhead, bright fluorescent lights cast a stark glow on the polished floors, reflecting hurried footsteps and rolling suitcases. Lena maneuvered through the crowd with determination, sidestepping distracted passengers glued to their phones and dodging clusters of families reuniting. Her heart pounded, not from nerves, but urgency. Her best friend Sophie was finally coming home after a year abroad, and Lena had promised to meet her at the gate. She barely made it, thanks to a long shift at the cafe running late. With a quick glance at the digital arrival board, she confirmed it. Sophie's flight had landed 20 minutes ago. Stretching onto her toes, Lena scanned the terminal, her eyes darting over waves of faces, people embracing, saying hurried goodbyes or waiting at baggage claim. She searched for Sophie's familiar curls, but instead, her gaze landed on someone else. A tall man stood near the large windows, his back turned to her. He was dressed in a charcoal gray suit, his broad shoulders framed by the soft glow of the city lights outside. The way he stood, the way he carried himself, it was just like Ethan, Sophie's older brother. Relief flooded through her. Ethan had mentioned he might come if he finished work early, but she hadn't expected him to arrive so soon. Without hesitation, Lena surged forward through the throng of travelers, weaving between bodies until she reached him. Before she could second-guess herself, she threw her arms around him, pressing her face against his chest. "Oh my God, I missed you so much," she blurted, her voice muffled against the fabric of his suit. Except something was wrong. His body was stiff, rigid in a way that didn't match the warmth she had expected. And then there was the scent, rich, woody cologne instead of Ethan's usual crisp citrus. The material under her fingertips felt different, too. Smooth, expensive, luxurious in a way she wasn't used to. A slow, creeping realization crawled up her spine. She had made a mistake. Lena pulled back abruptly, her breath catching as she tilted her head up, only to find herself staring into the face of a complete stranger. And not just any stranger. He was breathtaking in a way that was almost unfair, his features sharp and symmetrical, like they had been carefully carved by an artist. A strong jawline, high cheekbones, and a perfectly straight nose framed his face, but it was his eyes that struck her the most. Piercing gray, stormy, and unreadable. They locked onto hers with something between surprise and amusement. The silence between them stretched thick and charged. Heat surged to her cheeks. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she stammered, stepping back so quickly she nearly tripped over her own feet. The man's expression remained unreadable, though his brow arched slightly. "Well," he said, his voice deep and smooth, laced with something she couldn't quite place. That was unexpected. Mortification burned through her. She wanted to disappear, to dissolve into thin air and never be seen again. "I thought you were someone else," she rushed to explain, waving her hands as if that could erase the last 10 seconds. "I swear, I didn't mean to." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost imperceptibly, his calm demeanor only making her embarrassment worse. It was the angle, the reflection in the glass. "I only saw your back and I was emotional, which, I guess, makes me emotionally nearsighted or something." Why was she still talking? The stranger's smirk deepened. "Emotionally nearsighted?" he echoed, amusement flickering in his storm-gray eyes. Lena groaned internally. "Yes. When emotions override common sense, you see what you want to see instead of what's actually there," she blurted out, then immediately regretted it. Before he could respond, a large man in a sharp suit stepped forward, his stance protective. "Mr. Caldwell, is everything all right?" Lena froze. Caldwell. The name sent alarm bells ringing in her head. Nathan Caldwell. Her stomach dropped. Nathan Caldwell wasn't just any businessman. He was one of the most powerful financial moguls in the country. A billionaire whose name was whispered in corporate boardrooms. A man who rarely made public appearances and despised unnecessary attention. And she had just thrown herself at him. Lena inhaled sharply, her pulse pounding. Oh no. Nathan seemed to notice the moment realization dawned on her, because that arrogant smirk made a brief appearance before he spoke again. "You look nervous," he observed, crossing his arms. Lena blinked rapidly. I'm afraid of embarrassing moments being caught on security cameras and ending up on the internet," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. His gaze flickered to the suited man beside him before returning to her. Understandable. Oh no, was there already footage of this? Her eyes darted around the terminal, suddenly hyper-aware of the passing travelers. No one seemed to be paying them much attention. But what if someone had filmed it? What if this ended up online? I need to find my friend, she blurted out, desperate to escape. She turned to leave, but even as she walked away, she could still feel his eyes on her, sharp and unreadable. And somehow, deep in her gut, she knew Nathan Caldwell wasn't going to forget this encounter so easily. Nathan Caldwell was a name spoken in hushed tones across corporate boardrooms. He was known for being ruthless in business, a man who operated behind the scenes, pulling strings without ever stepping into the spotlight. And now, Lena had thrown herself at him. Her breath came fast and shallow as she stared at him, realization slamming into her like a freight train. Nathan must have noticed the moment it dawned on her, because that barely there smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, a brief, arrogant flicker. You look nervous, he observed, crossing his arms over his chest. Lena blinked rapidly. I'm afraid of embarrassing moments being caught on security cameras and ending up on the internet, she muttered, feeling her stomach churn. Nathan's gaze shifted briefly to the suited man beside him. Security, she assumed, before returning to her. Understandable, he said, his tone as composed as ever. Lena swallowed hard. Oh no. Was there already footage of this? She glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of every passing traveler. No one seemed to be paying them any attention, but what if someone had been recording? What if this ended up online? She needed to get out of here. I need to find my friend, she mumbled, barely above a whisper, before spinning on her heel. But as she walked away, she could feel his eyes still on her, their weight lingering like an unseen thread tying them together. And somehow, deep in her gut, she knew Nathan Caldwell wasn't just going to let this moment disappear. Hours later, Lena was back at work, standing behind the counter at Terminal Grounds Cafe, trying to focus on anything except the most humiliating encounter of her life. She had pushed it to the back of her mind. Mostly, until the doorbell chimed. She glanced up instinctively, her breath catching in her throat. Nathan Caldwell had just walked in. No, this could not be happening. He spotted her immediately, his storm-gray eyes locking onto hers with sharp precision. She stiffened, gripping the edge of the counter as if it could somehow keep her grounded. Nathan strolled toward her, his movements smooth and unhurried, exuding the kind of confidence that came naturally to men like him, men who owned every space they entered. He reached the counter, leaned slightly forward and said, "A coffee. But I want it made by you." Lena narrowed her eyes. He did not just do that. She wanted to ignore him. She should ignore him. But instead, she grabbed a notepad and let out a silent sigh. This was going to be a problem. Tightening her grip on the pen, she willed her face to remain neutral. Meanwhile, Nathan stood on the other side of the counter, calm and composed, his gaze never once leaving her. A flicker of amusement danced behind his eyes. A billionaire ordering coffee at an airport cafe wasn't exactly an everyday occurrence, especially not this billionaire. Especially not after what had happened earlier. Lena cleared her throat. What kind of coffee? Nathan's lips quirked slightly, as if indulging her in the pretense of this being a normal interaction. Black, of course. No sugar, no cream. Straight to the point, just like him. Without another word, Lena turned to prepare his order, silently praying that this would be the end of whatever this was. But as she worked, she could feel his gaze on her. It wasn't like the looks she had gotten from wealthy businessmen before, the entitled, dismissive stares of men who barely acknowledged service workers. Nathan Caldwell wasn't ignoring her. He was watching her, not impatiently, not condescendingly, just watching, like he had decided that she was something worth paying attention to. The realization made her uneasy. Pushing the thought aside, she set the cup in front of him. Here you go. Nathan lifted the coffee to his lips, taking a slow sip. Then, without taking his eyes off her, he murmured, "Now this is much better than an unexpected hug." Heat shot up her spine. So he was enjoying this. Lena narrowed her eyes. Are you always this charming, or is this a special effort just for me? Nathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he rested one hand on the counter, tilting his head slightly as he studied her. I make an effort when I find something intriguing, he said smoothly. Lena bristled. The way he said it, it wasn't flirtatious. But there was something calculated in his tone, like he was testing the waters, seeing how she would react. She exhaled through her nose, determined to keep this as professional as possible. Well, I hope you enjoy your coffee, Mr. Caldwell. She turned away, ignoring the way her skin still prickled under his gaze. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. For the next few days, Lena tried to shake the encounter from her mind. She told herself it was nothing. A passing moment of curiosity from a man who would forget about her the second he returned to his world of power and privilege. Except, Nathan Caldwell kept coming back. At first, she thought it was a coincidence. Maybe he had meetings nearby. Maybe somehow the coffee was actually better than she gave it credit for. But when he showed up 3 days in a row, always at the same time, always choosing the same seat, always watching her with that same quiet intensity, she knew. This wasn't an accident. She did her best to ignore him. She focused on taking orders from other customers, wiping down counters, restocking sugar packets, anything except acknowledging the billionaire who had inexplicably decided that her cafe was now his personal retreat. But ignoring Nathan Caldwell was like trying to pretend a storm wasn't gathering on the horizon. Inevitably, it would demand attention. On the 4th day, as she set his coffee down in front of him without so much as a glance, he finally spoke. You're avoiding me. Lena nearly rolled her eyes. Instead, she plastered on her most professional smile. I have a job to do, Mr. Caldwell. Nathan tapped his fingers against the table. That's not an answer. She clenched her jaw. Of course, he wasn't the type to let things go. Sighing, she finally met his gaze. Why are you here? Nathan tilted his head slightly, as if considering his response. Because I can be. Her irritation flared. Don't you have some multi-million-dollar deal to negotiate? Some high-profile event to attend? You don't exactly strike me as someone who enjoys airport cafes. Nathan studied her. Then, just when she thought he wasn't going to answer, he said, And you don't strike me as someone who likes being underestimated. Lena stiffened. The way he said it, so casually yet with undeniable certainty, made something inside her bristle. Because he wasn't wrong. She had spent her entire life proving herself. To teachers who doubted her, to employers who assumed she wouldn't work as hard, to customers who expected nothing but silent compliance. Nathan Caldwell's words were too sharp, too precise, and she hated that he had noticed. She squared her shoulders. I'm not. His lips quirked slightly. Good. Then, without another word, he returned to his coffee, as if the conversation had never happened. Lena exhaled slowly, turning back to her work, but no matter how much she tried to ignore it, something about Nathan Caldwell's presence lingered in her mind, and she had a feeling this wasn't over. But when Nathan Caldwell showed up 3 days in a row, always at the same time, always choosing the same seat, always watching her with that same quiet intensity, Lena knew this wasn't just a coincidence. He was there on purpose. She tried to ignore him. She took orders from other customers, wiped down counters, restocked sugar packets, doing anything and everything to avoid acknowledging the billionaire who, for some inexplicable reason, had decided that her cafe was now his personal hideout. But ignoring Nathan Caldwell was like pretending a storm wasn't creeping in on the horizon. At some point, it was going to demand attention. On the 4th day, when she set his coffee down in front of him without so much as a glance, he finally spoke. You're avoiding me. Lena nearly rolled her eyes. Instead, she put on her most professional smile. I have a job to do, Mr. Caldwell. Nathan tapped his fingers against the table, a slow, deliberate rhythm. That's not an answer. Lena clenched her jaw. Of course, he wasn't the type to let things go. Sighing, she finally met his gaze. Why are you here? Nathan tilted his head slightly, as if considering his response. Because I can be. Her irritation flared. Don't you have some multi-million-dollar deal to negotiate? Some high-profile event to attend? You don't exactly strike me as someone who enjoys sitting in airport cafes. Nathan studied her. Then, just when she thought he wasn't going to answer, he said, And you don't strike me as someone who likes being underestimated. Lena stiffened. The way he said it, so casually, yet with undeniable certainty, made something inside her bristle. Because he wasn't wrong. She had spent her entire life proving herself. to teachers who assumed she wasn't as capable as her peers, to employers who thought she wouldn't work as hard, to customers who looked at her and expected nothing but compliance. Nathan Caldwell's words were too sharp, too precise, and she hated that he had noticed. She squared her shoulders. "I'm not." His lips quirked slightly. "Good." Then, without another word, he returned to his coffee, as if the conversation had never happened. Lena exhaled slowly, turning back to her work. But no matter how much she tried to ignore it, something about Nathan Caldwell lingered in her mind. That night, as she walked home, she tried to push the encounter out of her thoughts. She had bigger problems, like Caleb. The medical bills had been stacking up faster than she could keep up with. Caleb had always been strong, always brushing off her concerns with a smile. But lately, he had been getting worse. His doctor had warned her weeks ago he needed more intensive treatment soon. And Lena didn't know how she was going to afford it. She had already been picking up extra shifts, stretching herself thin, saving every possible dollar. But it still wasn't enough. And now, on top of everything else, a billionaire had decided to make her his latest curiosity. Why? What did Nathan Caldwell even want from her? The next day, he was there again. This time, Lena didn't pretend not to notice. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, and in no mood for whatever game he was playing. As she set his coffee down in front of him, she crossed her arms. "Okay, enough. What do you actually want?" Nathan met her gaze without hesitation. "To talk." Lena frowned. "About what?" His fingers drummed lightly against the table. "You." Her stomach flipped. Though whether it was from irritation or something else, she wasn't sure. "Why?" she demanded. Nathan leaned back slightly as if this were the easiest question in the world. "Because you don't treat me like everyone else does." Lena blinked. That was not what she expected. She had been prepared for arrogance, for some smug remark about how she should be flattered that he was paying attention to her. But this, she didn't know what to do with this. Nathan tilted his head slightly. "You don't care who I am." His voice was calm, certain. "Or at least," he continued, "you're pretending not to." Lena inhaled sharply. She was pretending, wasn't she? Because the truth was, Nathan Caldwell did affect her. She just didn't want to admit it. So instead, she gave him the only response she could think of. "I really don't have time for this." She turned to walk away. But even as she did, she could feel his eyes still on her, still watching. And somehow, she knew this wasn't over. That night, Lena barely slept. Even after she had crawled into bed, exhaustion weighing her down, her mind refused to quiet. She told herself she didn't care about Nathan Caldwell's sudden interest in her. She told herself it didn't matter, that it was just some fleeting amusement for him, the way rich men like to play with things they didn't understand before tossing them aside. But deep down, something gnawed at her. The way he watched her. The way he noticed things others didn't. The way he claimed to enjoy talking to her, not because of what she could offer him, but because she didn't treat him like everyone else did. It didn't make sense. And Lena hated things that didn't make sense. Lena woke up groggy, tangled in the remnants of restless thoughts that refused to let her sleep. It was just another morning, except it wasn't. She checked on Caleb first, as she always did. He was awake but tired, eating breakfast slowly while pretending everything was fine. His temperature was normal, but that didn't stop the gnawing worry in her chest. After making sure he had everything he needed, she hurried out the door, already running on fumes. By the time she arrived at Terminal Grounds Cafe, she was exhausted. Her shift had barely begun when the familiar chime of the cafe door rang through the quiet hum of early morning travelers. She knew it was him before she even turned around. Nathan Caldwell. He walked in with the same composed stride, dressed in yet another impeccable tailored suit, carrying that effortless air of authority that made it impossible to ignore him. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look around. He went straight to his usual table by the window, as if it had always belonged to him. Lena exhaled slowly. This had to stop. Grabbing her notepad, not that she needed it, she made her way over. She already knew what he was going to order. Nathan glanced up as she approached, amusement flickering in his storm-gray eyes. "You look tired," he noted, his voice smooth as ever. Lena clenched her jaw. She was not in the mood for this today. "What do you want, Caldwell?" His mouth twitched at the way she said his last name, as if he found it amusing. The usual. She scribbled something down on the notepad, pointlessly, and turned to leave. Then she froze. He had never said her name before, not once. Slowly, she turned back, wary. "How do you know my name?" Nathan didn't blink. "You wear a name tag." Lena glanced down. Damn it. She had completely forgotten. "You've been coming here for days, Caldwell," she muttered. "It's not that impressive that you finally read it." He tilted his head slightly, studying her like she was a puzzle he was determined to figure out. "True," he mused, "but I wanted to say it." Something about the way he said it sent an unwelcome shiver down her spine. She needed to shut this conversation down before he pulled her deeper into whatever this was. "Your coffee will be ready soon," she muttered, walking away before he could say anything else. But even as she worked behind the counter, preparing his order, she could feel his presence. He wasn't just sitting there, absent-mindedly scrolling through his phone or reading the news like most businessmen did. He was watching her. And she hated how aware of it she was. She placed the cup in front of him with just a little too much force, then turned to leave. "Lena!" She gritted her teeth. He was doing this on purpose. Slowly, she turned back, crossing her arms. "What, Caldwell?" He took a slow sip of his coffee before setting the cup down. "Why do you work here?" Lena blinked. "What?" "It's an honest question." "No," she said flatly. "It's a condescending question." His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his gaze, a flicker of curiosity. "I don't mean it that way." Lena inhaled sharply, already regretting engaging in this conversation. "I work here," she said carefully, "because I have bills to pay." Shocking, I know. Nathan didn't look shocked. If anything, he looked intrigued. "You're too sharp to be taking orders from impatient travelers all day." Lena scoffed. "And you're too rich to be drinking airport cafe coffee every morning," she shot back. "But here we are." A slow smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "Damn it." She turned to walk away again, but his next words stopped her in her tracks. "I know about your brother." Lena went completely still. Slowly, she turned back to him, her pulse hammering. "Excuse me?" Nathan's gaze didn't waver. "I overheard you talking to a coworker the other day," he said, "about the medical bills." Heat surged through her, an ugly, defensive heat. "So what?" His fingers tapped against the table. Once, a measured sound. "Why haven't you asked for help?" Lena let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "From you?" Nathan shrugged, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Why not?" She stared at him, unblinking. Then, with a voice that was steadier than she felt, she said, "Let me explain something to you, Caldwell." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I don't take money from men like you. I don't take favors. And I don't let people like you pretend to be generous when it costs them nothing." His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. "People like me," he repeated. "Yes," she snapped. "People who have everything handed to them. People who think throwing money at a problem makes it go away." Nathan exhaled slowly, then leaned back in his chair, studying her. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then finally, he said, "Fair enough." Lena expected that to be the end of it. It wasn't. Nathan picked up his cup, took another sip of coffee, and then, as if it were just a casual afterthought, said, "Then let's make a deal." Lena narrowed her eyes. "What kind of deal?" He set his cup down. "You cook for me." She blinked. "What?" "For 1 week," he continued, as if he hadn't just said something absolutely insane. 3 meals a day at my place." Lena gaped at him. "You're joking." "No." She shook her head, half laughing. "Why the hell would I do that?" Nathan met her gaze evenly. "Because I'll pay you more than you make here in a month." He let the words settle before adding, "And you'll have enough to cover your brother's treatment." Lena's breath caught. The offer was ridiculous. Unbelievable. And yet, her stomach twisted painfully. Caleb, his treatment, the bills stacking up. Nathan Caldwell was offering her a way out. But could she trust him? She wanted to say no. She should say no. But instead, she found herself staring at him, at the quiet confidence in his expression, at the way he wasn't pressuring her, just presenting the choice. And for the first time in a long time, Lena hesitated. Because despite everything, despite her pride, despite her distrust, she needed the money. And Nathan Caldwell knew it. Nathan Caldwell's offer was insane. Unbelievable. And yet, Lena's stomach twisted painfully as she sat on her worn-out couch, staring at the ceiling. He had given her an out, an opportunity to make more money in 1 week than she did in a month. Enough to cover Caleb's medical bills, enough to buy him time. It should have been an easy decision. But nothing about Nathan Caldwell was ever easy. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust his sudden interest in her. Didn't trust the perfect timing of his offer. And yet, she wasn't naive enough to think she could afford to turn it down. Caleb was getting worse. He put on a brave face, smiling, cracking jokes, pretending he was fine. But Lena saw it. The way he winced when he moved, the way exhaustion clung to him like a weight he couldn't shake. He needed better treatment, and that required money. More than she had. More than she could save in time. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. A week, just a week. The next morning, when she walked into Terminal Grounds Cafe, she wasn't surprised to see him. Nathan was already sitting at his usual table, waiting, as if he knew she would come with an answer. Lena walked over, arms crossed. Fine. Nathan lifted his gaze to hers. A flicker of satisfaction passed through his storm-gray eyes. You'll cook for me? 1 week, she clarified. That's it. He nodded, unbothered. 1 week. Lena exhaled, arms tightening around herself. I don't trust you. Nathan's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Noted. She narrowed her eyes at him. If you try anything, I won't, he said smoothly. This is a business arrangement. Business arrangement. Right. Then why did it feel like something else entirely? She shook off the thought. When do I start? Tonight. She stared at him. Tonight? Nathan nodded, unfazed. I'll send a car to pick you up. Lena bristled. Of course, he just assumed she couldn't get there on her own. But she held her tongue. If he wanted to act like a billionaire who had never met someone without a driver, that was his problem. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. I'm glad you agreed. Lena didn't respond. She wasn't sure she was. That evening, she stood outside her tiny apartment, staring at the sleek black car idling at the curb. The uniformed driver stepped out, nodding politely as he opened the door for her. She hesitated. She hated this. Hated the way it made her feel like she was stepping into another world, one that wasn't hers. But then she thought of Caleb. And she climbed inside. The city blurred past the tinted windows, the bright lights turning into streaks of gold and silver as the car moved through streets she rarely visited. The closer they got to Nathan's neighborhood, the more the scenery changed. Old apartment buildings disappeared, replaced by skyscrapers of glass and steel. Bustling streets faded into quiet, pristine avenues lined with luxury boutiques and high-end restaurants. By the time the car pulled up to his building, Lena's hands were clenched into fists. She didn't belong here. And the doorman's carefully measured politeness told her that he knew it too. Nathan's penthouse was on the top floor. Of course, it was. The elevator ride felt endless. A quiet hum filled the space as she tried to steady her nerves. When the doors finally slid open, she stepped out into a hallway that led to an entrance bigger than her entire living room. And then, Nathan was there, leaning casually against the doorframe, watching her with unreadable eyes. Welcome. Lena exhaled, squaring her shoulders. Let's get this over with. Nathan pushed off the doorframe, stepping aside so she could enter. She took one step inside, and immediately regretted it. The place was ridiculous. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows framed a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The entire penthouse was bathed in warm golden light. Everything was sleek, modern, expensive, from the leather furniture to the marble countertops in the open kitchen. Lena swallowed hard, refusing to let her awe show. Nathan gestured toward the kitchen. Everything you need is already here. Lena forced her feet to move. The floor was so polished, she was terrified of slipping. The kitchen looked like something out of a high-end cooking show. Stainless steel appliances, an island larger than her entire dining table. Shelves stocked with ingredients she had only ever seen in gourmet stores. She turned to him, crossing her arms. You do realize you don't need a personal chef, right? Nathan's mouth quirked. That would be boring. Lena rolled her eyes, muttering under her breath as she moved to inspect the fridge. At least he hadn't been lying about one thing. Everything she needed was here. Fresh produce, quality meats, spices arranged in perfect rows. Fine. She could do this. She tied her apron around her waist, shaking off the tension in her shoulders. She wasn't here to impress him. She was here to cook, to finish the job, to walk away with the money she needed. As she moved through the kitchen, preparing the first meal of the night, she could feel him watching her. He didn't hover, didn't interfere, but he was there, sitting at the counter, sipping what looked like a glass of whiskey, observing her every move. She tried to ignore it, tried to pretend it didn't affect her. But when she turned around and found him still looking at her, with quiet, unwavering focus, something inside her tightened. "What?" she snapped, setting down the knife a little harder than necessary. Nathan didn't blink. "I was just wondering." "Wondering what?" "If you always cook like you're at war with the ingredients," Lena scowled. "This is how I cook." Nathan's gaze flickered to her hands. "Your shoulders are tense." She bristled. "You've been watching me for exactly 20 minutes, Caldwell. You don't know how I cook." He took a slow sip of his drink. "I know enough." She exhaled sharply, turning back to the stove. "Just let me work." For the rest of the evening, he did. He didn't speak again, didn't interrupt, just sat there, occasionally glancing at his phone, but never truly looking away. When she finally plated the meal and set it in front of him, he took his time, picking up the fork, tasting the food with an unreadable expression. Lena watched, arms crossed. "Well?" Nathan took another bite, then nodded slightly. Impressive. Something inside her relaxed, not because she cared what he thought, but because, at least she wasn't failing. One meal down, 6 more days to go. She could handle this. Even if, deep down, she had a feeling this arrangement was about to become far more complicated than she had ever anticipated. Lena's feet barely touched the polished floor as she moved through Nathan Caldwell's extravagant kitchen. Everything gleamed: stainless steel appliances, marble countertops, and a refrigerator stocked like a gourmet market. She should have felt in control. This was her domain, after all. But the weight of Nathan's presence at the kitchen counter made her skin prickle. He wasn't hovering, he wasn't interrupting, he was just there, sipping whiskey, watching her every move. She gritted her teeth and focused on her work, refusing to acknowledge him. But when she turned around and found him still staring at her, quiet and unreadable, something inside her tightened. "What?" she snapped, setting down the knife a little harder than necessary. Nathan didn't blink. "I was just wondering." Her irritation flared. "Wondering what?" "If you always cook like you're at war with the ingredients." Lena scowled. "This is how I cook." His gaze flickered to her hands. "Your shoulders are tense," she bristled. "You've been watching me for exactly 20 minutes, Caldwell. You don't know how I cook." Nathan took a slow sip of his drink. "I know enough." She exhaled sharply, turning back to the stove. "Just let me work." For the rest of the evening, he did. He didn't speak again, didn't interrupt, just sat there, occasionally glanced at his phone, but never truly looked away. When she finally plated the meal and set it in front of him, he took his time, picking up the fork, tasting the food with an unreadable expression. Lena crossed her arms. "Well?" Nathan took another bite, then nodded slightly. Impressive. Something inside her relaxed, not because she cared what he thought, but because, at least, she wasn't failing. As Nathan finished his meal, Lena busied herself with cleaning up, moving through the kitchen with the same practiced efficiency she had at Terminal Grounds Cafe, and for the first time since she had stepped into his world. She let herself breathe. One meal down, 6 more days to go. She could handle this, even if deep down she had a feeling this arrangement was going to be far more complicated than she had anticipated. The next morning, Lena arrived at Nathan's penthouse with her shoulders squared and her resolve firm. She had survived the first evening without incident, and she fully intended to keep things that way. This was a job, nothing more. She would cook, she would get paid, and in a few days she would walk away without looking back. The elevator ride up was quiet, but her thoughts were anything but. Nathan Caldwell was a complication she hadn't expected. He was arrogant, sharp-eyed, and far too observant for her liking. But beneath all that, there was something else, something unsettling. She had spent the entire night trying to ignore the way he watched her while she worked. It wasn't the usual entitled way rich men looked at service workers. It was something deeper, something like curiosity. And she didn't like it. When the elevator doors slid open, she braced herself, steady, focused. Another day of cooking under his gaze. She wasn't expecting to find him already in the kitchen. Nathan stood at the counter, dressed more casually than usual. No tailored suit today, just dark pants and a fitted button-down, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His hair was slightly tousled, like he had run his fingers through it a few times. For a split second, Lena was caught off guard. He looked different. Less like a billionaire. More like a regular man who had just woken up. She quickly shook off the thought. "You're early," he said, setting down the coffee cup he had been holding. She glanced at the clock on the wall. "You said breakfast at 8. It's 7:58. Nathan smirked. "Punctual." Lena ignored him, dropping her bag on the counter and rolling up her sleeves. "Any special requests?" He shook his head. "Surprise me." She exhaled sharply. "Of course." As she moved through the kitchen, pulling out ingredients, she tried to pretend he wasn't there. She focused on chopping vegetables, whisking eggs, heating the pan. But no matter how much she concentrated, she could still feel him watching. Always watching. Finally, she turned around, irritation flaring. "Do you ever do anything other than stare?" Nathan arched a brow, completely unbothered. "I enjoy observing things." Lena rolled her eyes and turned back to the stove. "Go observe something else." His lips quirked as he took another sip of coffee. "I like watching you cook." Her grip tightened on the spatula. Impossible. Despite her annoyance, she couldn't stop the heat from creeping up her neck. By the time she plated his breakfast, scrambled eggs with fresh herbs, crisp toast, and perfectly cooked bacon, she had convinced herself that she didn't care whether he liked it or not. But then he took a bite, and for the first time since they met, Nathan Caldwell actually looked surprised. Lena narrowed her eyes. "What?" He chewed slowly, then set his fork down. "This is good." Lena crossed her arms. "Did you think I was going to feed you garbage?" Nathan's smirk returned, but there was something genuine in his expression now. "I didn't expect it to be this good." She hated that the compliment sent a small jolt of satisfaction through her. "It's just eggs," she muttered, turning back to the sink. Nathan lifted his coffee cup. "Eggs, made by someone who knows what they're doing." Lena didn't answer. She didn't want to acknowledge the fact that she liked hearing it. For the next few days, their routine continued. She arrived early, cooked 3 meals a day, and did her best to ignore the fact that Nathan spent an unreasonable amount of time near the kitchen whenever she was there. At first, she thought he was just playing some kind of game. But then, something shifted. It started with small things. Nathan would occasionally roll up his sleeves and help set the table, even though he clearly had never done it before. He would ask questions about the dishes she made, listening intently when she explained techniques and flavors. And then, there were the conversations. At first they were casual, nothing personal, nothing deep. But then, one evening, as she was cooking dinner, Nathan leaned against the counter. "Why did you start cooking?" Lena hesitated. Flipped the chicken in the pan before answering. "I had to," she swallowed. "When my parents died, I had to take care of Caleb. Cooking was part of that." Nathan was silent for a moment. Then finally, "I see." That was it. No empty platitudes, no awkward apologies. And for some reason, that made it easier to keep talking. The airport was a sea of movement, a constant rush of voices blending into an overwhelming hum. Announcements echoed through the terminal, calling for passengers, listing flight delays, urging last-minute boarders to hurry. Fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over the polished tile floors, reflecting the hurried steps of countless travelers. Lena weaved through the crowd with determination, dodging rolling suitcases and distracted passengers glued to their phones. Her heart pounded, not from nerves, but urgency. Her best friend, Sophie, was arriving after a year of studying abroad, and Lena had promised to meet her at the gate. She had barely made it in time, thanks to her shift at Terminal Grounds Cafe running late. She glanced up at the large digital screen displaying flight arrivals. Sophie's plane had landed 20 minutes ago. Scanning the crowd, Lena stretched onto her toes to get a better view. The terminal was packed, people embracing loved ones, exchanging hurried goodbyes, standing in clusters at baggage claim. Her eyes darted across the sea of faces, searching for Sophie's familiar curls. Instead, her gaze locked onto a tall figure in a charcoal gray suit near the large glass windows. His posture was straight and confident, his dark brown hair neatly styled. From behind, with his broad shoulders and the way he stood, he looked just like Sophie's older brother, Ethan. Relief flooded through her. Ethan had mentioned he might pick Sophie up if he finished work in time, but she hadn't expected him to get here so quickly. Without thinking, without second-guessing herself, Lena pushed through the throng of people, reaching him before she had time to reconsider. Her arms wrapped around him in a tight, familiar embrace. "Oh my God, I missed you so much," she blurted, her voice muffled against his chest. Except something was off. His body was tense, rigid in a way that didn't match the warmth she expected. His suit smelled different too, a rich, woody cologne instead of Ethan's usual fresh citrus scent. The fabric beneath her fingertips felt unfamiliar. High quality, luxurious in a way she wasn't accustomed to. A shiver of realization crept up her spine. She had made a mistake. Lena pulled back abruptly, her breath catching as she tilted her head up. The man staring down at her was most definitely not Ethan. He was a stranger. A painfully handsome stranger. His features were sharp, symmetrical, as if sculpted with careful precision. High cheekbones, a strong jawline, a perfectly straight nose. But what struck her most were his eyes. Cold, piercing gray, stormy and unreadable. They locked onto her with a mix of surprise and something else she couldn't quite place. The silence stretched, heavy and charged. Heat rushed to her face. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she stammered, stepping back so quickly she nearly tripped over her own feet. His expression remained unreadable, though his brow arched ever so slightly. "Well," he said, his voice deep and smooth, "that was unexpected." Lena wanted to disappear. Melt into the floor and be swallowed whole. How could she have made such a ridiculous mistake? She waved her hands frantically, as if that could erase the past 10 seconds. "I thought you were someone else, I swear. I didn't mean to." The corners of his mouth twitched, amusement flickering in his gaze. Lena groaned internally. Why was she still talking? "It was the angle," she continued, words tumbling out faster than she could stop them. "The reflection in the glass. I only saw your back, and I was emotional, which I guess makes me emotionally nearsighted or something." That barely there smirk deepened. Emotionally nearsighted? She clenched her jaw. Yes, when emotions override common sense, you see what you want to see instead of what's actually there. A flash of amusement flickered across his face, but before he could respond, a large suited man, who looked suspiciously like security, stepped up beside him. "Mr. Caldwell, is everything all right?" Lena froze. Caldwell. The name sent alarm bells ringing in her head. She had heard it before. Nathan Caldwell. Her stomach dropped. Nathan Caldwell wasn't just a businessman. He was one of the most powerful financial moguls in the country, a billionaire whose name was spoken in hushed tones across corporate boardrooms. He rarely appeared in public, preferring to operate behind the scenes, and he despised unnecessary attention. And she had just thrown herself at him. Lena inhaled sharply, her pulse pounding. Oh no. Nathan seemed to notice the wave of realization wash over her because that smirk made a brief, arrogant appearance before he spoke. "You look nervous," he observed, crossing his arms. Lena blinked rapidly. I'm afraid of embarrassing mistakes being caught on security cameras and ending up on the internet." His gaze flickered to the security guard before returning to her. "Understandable." Oh no. Was there already footage of this? She glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of every passing traveler. No one seemed to be paying them any mind, but what if someone had been filming? What if this ended up online? "I need to find my friend," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned to leave, but she could feel his eyes on her as she walked away. Her skin prickled under his gaze. And somehow, she knew. He wasn't just going to let her disappear into the crowd. Lena's voice wavered, but she clenched her jaw, holding back the emotion threatening to spill over. "I don't want anything from you." Nathan's expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his eyes. Something like regret. She didn't care. She turned on her heel and walked out of his penthouse, slamming the door behind her. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Because if she did, she might see the way Nathan Caldwell stood there, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. And for the first time in his life, he didn't know how to fix what had broken. Lena barely remembered the journey home. She barely registered the cold air biting at her skin as she stepped onto the crowded streets. She barely noticed the honking taxis, the blur of lights, the distant hum of the city that had always been her home. Her mind was too full. Full of betrayal, full of anger, full of him. Nathan Caldwell. She had let her guard down. She had let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't like the others. That he wasn't just another man born into privilege who thought money could erase the past. But she had been wrong. No matter how much he claimed he hadn't known, no matter how much he tried to separate himself from the company his family had built, he had still benefited from it. He had still lived in his perfect penthouse while her family had lost everything. And she had been naive enough to think he was different. Her hands clenched into fists as she stepped onto the sidewalk in front of her apartment building. She needed to focus. She needed to forget about him. Her phone rang. The sharp sound cut through her spiraling thoughts like a blade. Frowning, she pulled it from her pocket, her breath catching when she saw the name on the screen. The hospital. Lena's stomach twisted. For a split second, she couldn't move. Then, with trembling fingers, she answered. "Hello? Miss Rivera?" came the calm but firm voice on the other end. "A doctor. It's about Caleb." Everything inside her went cold. The hospital was too bright, too sterile. Lena rushed through the hallways, barely aware of anything except the pounding of her own heartbeat. Her lungs felt tight, her legs unsteady, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She reached the nurse's station, her voice coming out in a breathless rush. "My brother, Caleb Rivera. Where is he?" The nurse looked up, her expression sympathetic. "He's stable, but the doctor needs to speak with you." Stable. Lena clung to that word, forcing herself to breathe. She followed the nurse down the hall, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. Had he collapsed? Had his condition worsened? Had she missed the signs? She should have been home. She should have been with him. Instead, she'd been standing in a billionaire's penthouse, letting herself believe in something that was never meant to be. The nurse led her into a small consultation room. A doctor stood by the window, flipping through a chart. He looked up as she entered, offering a small nod. "Miss Rivera." Lena's throat felt dry. "What happened?" The doctor sighed, closing the file. "Caleb's condition took a turn this evening. He experienced severe fatigue, dizziness, and chest pains. We ran some tests, and while he's stable now, the results confirm what we feared." Lena's stomach twisted painfully. "He needs surgery," the doctor continued gently. "Sooner rather than later. Without it, his condition will continue to deteriorate." Lena swayed slightly, gripping the edge of the chair to keep herself steady. "How much?" she whispered. The doctor hesitated. "The cost is significant, Miss Rivera. Even with insurance, the expenses for the procedure and post-operative care will be high." Lena didn't need him to say the number out loud. She already knew. It was more than she had, more than she could ever earn in time. Her throat tightened. "And if I can't pay?" The doctor's silence was all the answer she needed. Her vision blurred. This couldn't be happening. She had done everything right. She had worked, saved, sacrificed, and it still wasn't enough. Her fingers dug into the chair, nails pressing into the worn fabric. She had one option, but she hated it. Lena didn't remember leaving the hospital. She barely remembered stepping outside, the cold night air numbing her skin. Her thoughts were a mess. Her pride screamed at her to find another way, to figure it out on her own. But Caleb's life wasn't something she could gamble with. And the one person who had the power to change everything was the last person she wanted to see. Nathan Caldwell. The thought of going back to him after everything made her sick. But she had no choice. Before she could second-guess herself, she pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through her contacts. She found his number. She had never saved it, but she had memorized it. For a long moment, she just stared at the screen. Then, swallowing her pride, she hit call. He picked up on the second ring. "Lena?" His voice was calm, steady, but there was something in it, something different from before. She exhaled sharply, closing her eyes. "Caleb needs surgery," she said, forcing the words out before she lost her nerve. There was a brief pause. Then, without hesitation, Nathan said, "Where are you?" 20 minutes later, a sleek black car pulled up outside the hospital. Nathan stepped out, his expression unreadable. His suit was immaculate as always, but there was a tension in his posture, a sharpness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Lena stood stiffly, arms crossed as he approached. "I can handle this," she said, even though they both knew she couldn't. Nathan ignored the statement. "How much?" She hesitated. "A lot." He pulled out his phone. "Give me the details." Lena clenched her jaw. I don't want your charity. Nathan's gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. This isn't charity. Then what is it? She demanded. He exhaled, fingers tightening around his phone. It's me fixing what should never have been broken. Something inside her twisted painfully. Because she knew he wasn't just talking about the money, but she didn't have the strength to fight him right now. So, without another word, she gave him the details. And within minutes, it was done. Just like that, Caleb's surgery was paid for, his life was saved, and Lena had never felt more relieved or more lost. She swallowed, looking up at Nathan. Why are you doing this? His jaw tightened. Because I can. It wasn't an answer, not really, but for now it was enough. She looked away, exhaling slowly. Thank you. Nathan didn't respond right away. Then, softly, he said, always. And for the first time since she had learned the truth about his past, since she had walked out of his penthouse, vowing never to look back, Lena wasn't sure she wanted to walk away anymore. Found his number. She had never saved it, but she had memorized it. For a long moment, she just stared at the screen. Then, swallowing her pride, she hit call. He picked up on the second ring. Lena. Nathan's voice was calm, steady. But there was something in it. Something different from before. She exhaled sharply, closing her eyes. Caleb needs surgery, she said, forcing the words out before she lost her nerve. There was a brief pause. Then, without hesitation, Nathan said, Where are you? 20 minutes later, a sleek black car pulled up outside the hospital. Nathan stepped out, his expression unreadable. His suit was immaculate as always, but there was a tension in his posture, a sharpness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Lena stood stiffly, arms crossed, as he approached. I can handle this, she said, even though they both knew she couldn't. Nathan ignored the statement. How much? She hesitated. A lot. He pulled out his phone. Give me the details. Lena clenched her jaw. I don't want your charity. Nathan's gaze met hers, steady and unwavering. This isn't charity. Then what is it? She demanded. He exhaled, fingers tightening around his phone. It's me fixing what should never have been broken. Something inside her twisted painfully, because she knew he wasn't just talking about the money, but she didn't have the strength to fight him right now. So, without another word, she gave him the details, and within minutes, it was done. Just like that, Caleb's surgery was paid for, his life was saved, and Lena had never felt more relieved or more lost. She swallowed, looking up at Nathan. Why are you doing this? His jaw tightened. Because I can. It wasn't an answer, not really, but for now it was enough. She looked away, exhaling slowly. Thank you. Nathan didn't respond right away. Then, softly, he said, Always. And for the first time since she had learned the truth about his past, since she had walked out of his penthouse, vowing never to look back, Lena wasn't sure she wanted to walk away anymore. The hospital room was quiet, except for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Lena sat beside Caleb's bed, her hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. Exhaustion pressed down on her, but relief coursed through her veins like a lifeline. Caleb was going to be okay. The surgery had gone smoothly. The doctors were optimistic about his recovery. The dark cloud of uncertainty that had hovered over her for months had finally lifted. But even as she exhaled, feeling a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying slip from her shoulders, another truth settled deep in her bones. Nathan had done this. He had paid for everything, without hesitation, without conditions, and that terrified her. Because Lena didn't owe anyone. She had spent her life making sure of that. And now, no matter how much she told herself otherwise, she owed him. Her grip tightened on the coffee cup. She had to return the money, even if it took her years. A soft groan from the bed made her snap out of her thoughts. Caleb stirred, his dark lashes fluttering against his cheeks before his eyes slowly opened. She immediately leaned forward. Hey! His gaze was unfocused at first, but when he looked at her, a weak smile pulled at his lips. You look terrible. A laugh broke from her before she could stop it, a mix of relief and lingering nerves. And you look like someone who just had surgery. Caleb's smile faded slightly as he looked around the sterile room, confusion flickering across his face. How did you? Lena knew the question before he even finished it. She hesitated, then finally she sighed. Nathan paid for it. Caleb's brows lifted. The billionaire? She nodded. Caleb blinked, still groggy but clearly surprised. Wow. What did you have to promise him? Your soul? Lena scoffed, rolling her eyes. No, just, she hesitated. Nothing. And that was the truth. Nathan hadn't asked for anything. He had done it simply because he could. Caleb exhaled, shaking his head. Guess I owe the guy my life. Lena swallowed. No, I do. And that was the problem. Because she had spent her whole life standing on her own, refusing to let anyone hold power over her. And now, Nathan Caldwell had stepped into her world and shifted everything she thought she knew about men like him. And she had no idea what to do about it. 2 days later, she found herself standing outside Nathan's penthouse. She wasn't sure how she had ended up here. She had told herself she wouldn't come, that she would find another way to repay him, that she didn't need to see him again. But here she was, heart pounding. She knocked once. The door opened almost immediately. Nathan stood there, dressed in a dark gray sweater and black pants, his usual composed expression slipping into something unreadable as he took her in. Lena! Her stomach tightened at the way he said her name. Soft, steady, careful. She forced herself to stand straighter. Can we talk? He stepped aside silently, letting her in. The penthouse looked the same as the last time she had been here. Sleek, modern, filled with an emptiness that didn't quite match the man standing in front of her. Nathan gestured toward the couch. Sit. She hesitated, but finally she sat down. Nathan remained standing for a moment before finally lowering himself into the chair across from her. Silence stretched between them. Then he spoke. How's Caleb? Lena exhaled, running a hand through her hair. Recovering. The doctors say he'll be okay. Nathan nodded. Good. More silence. Lena hated it. She took a slow breath. I came to pay you back. Nathan's brows lifted slightly. For the surgery? She nodded. His gaze flickered with something, amusement maybe, frustration, but he didn't laugh. You can't afford that. I will, she said firmly. Even if it takes me years. Nathan exhaled, leaning forward slightly. I didn't do it for repayment. That's not the point, she snapped. I don't want to owe you. His gaze locked onto hers. You don't. Lena clenched her jaw. Then why did you do it? Nathan studied her for a long moment before answering. Because I care. Her breath caught. She wasn't expecting that. She was expecting something logical. Something calculated. Not that. Not something so simple. So raw. She forced out a weak laugh. You barely know me. Nathan's lips twitched, but his gaze remained serious. I know enough. Lena shook her head, standing abruptly. I don't need this. Nathan stood too. Then why are you here? She hesitated. She had come to pay him back. To walk away. But now, standing here facing him, she wasn't so sure. I don't know, she admitted quietly. Nathan exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. Then stay. She looked up at him. Why? He took a step closer. You've been running since the moment we met, Lena. His voice was quiet, steady. But you don't have to run from me. Her pulse pounded. She wanted to argue, to push him away. But she didn't. And for the first time, she let herself breathe, stepped aside without a word, letting her in. The penthouse was just as she remembered. Sleek, modern, a world so far removed from her own. But tonight it felt different. Quieter. Heavier. Michael walked ahead of her, his posture relaxed but his movements precise, like he was bracing for whatever she had come to say. He turned to face her. How's Omar? She exhaled. Recovering. The doctors say he'll be okay. Michael nodded. Good. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Aisha swallowed, then forced herself to meet his gaze. I came to pay you back. His brow lifted slightly. For the surgery? She nodded. A flicker of something, amusement, maybe frustration, crossed his face, but he didn't laugh. You can't afford that, he said simply. I will, she shot back, even if it takes me years. Michael exhaled, leaning against the kitchen counter. I didn't do it for repayment. That's not the point. She snapped. I don't want to owe you. His gaze locked onto hers. You don't. Aisha clenched her fists. Then why did you do it? He studied her for a long moment before answering. Because I care. Her breath caught. She had expected arrogance, a casual dismissal, maybe even a cold transaction. But not this, not something so simple, so raw. She let out a weak laugh. You barely know me. Michael tilted his head slightly. I know enough. Aisha shook her head, heart pounding. She didn't know how to process this. She didn't know how to believe him. So she did what she always did, she turned to leave. But before she reached the door, his voice stopped her. Then why are you here? She hesitated. She had come to settle a debt, but now, standing here, she wasn't so sure. I don't know, she admitted quietly. Michael took a step closer, his voice steady. Then stay. She looked up at him, searching for something. An ulterior motive, a hidden agenda. But all she saw was sincerity. A part of her wanted to fight it, to run, like she always had. But for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to. So instead of leaving, she stayed. The airport in Ravenshore was a chaotic symphony of movement, voices blending into a constant hum as announcements echoed through the terminal. People rushed in all directions, rolling suitcases bumping against hurried travelers glued to their phones. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a sharp glow against the polished floors, reflecting the frenzy of arrivals and departures. Through the crowd, Elena moved with determination, dodging obstacles as she weaved her way toward the arrivals gate. Her heart wasn't racing from nerves. This was an emergency. Sophia, her best friend, was returning after a year of studying abroad, and Elena had promised to meet her at the gate. She had barely made it in time, her shift at the cafe running longer than expected. Her eyes flicked to the large digital screen displaying arrivals. Sophia's flight had landed 20 minutes ago. Elena stretched onto her toes, scanning the crowd. The terminal was packed. People embracing loved ones, exchanging hurried goodbyes, or waiting impatiently at baggage claim. Her gaze locked onto a tall figure in a charcoal gray suit standing near one of the large glass windows. His posture, straight, confident, familiar. From behind, with those broad shoulders and the way he carried himself, he looked just like Daniel, Sophia's older brother. Relief flooded through her. Daniel had mentioned that he might pick Sophia up if he got off work early, but Elena hadn't expected him to get here so fast. She didn't think, she just moved. Pushing through the throng of people, she reached him before she could reconsider, her arms wrapping around him in a tight, familiar embrace. "Oh my God, I missed you so much," she blurted, her voice muffled against his chest. Except, something was wrong. His body stiffened beneath her touch. His suit smelled different, a deep, woody cologne instead of Daniel's usual crisp citrus scent. The fabric under her fingertips felt unfamiliar, luxurious in a way she wasn't used to. A shiver of realization climbed up her spine. She had made a mistake. Elena pulled back abruptly, her breath catching as she tilted her head up. The man staring down at her was not Daniel. He was a stranger. A painfully handsome stranger. His sharp features were almost sculpted, high cheekbones, a strong jawline, a perfectly straight nose. But it was his eyes that struck her most, storm gray, cold, unreadable. They locked onto her with a mix of surprise and something else she couldn't quite name. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Heat flooded her cheeks. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she stammered, stumbling backward so quickly she nearly tripped over her own feet. The stranger arched a single brow, his expression unreadable. "Well," he said, voice deep and smooth. "That was unexpected." Elena's mortification deepened. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor and never resurface. She waved her hands as if she could erase the past 10 seconds. "I thought you were someone else. I swear I didn't mean to." The corner of his mouth twitched, just barely. "Oh no," he was amused. She groaned internally. "It was the angle, the reflection in the glass. I only saw your back, and I was emotional, which I guess makes me emotionally nearsighted or something." That almost smirk deepened. Elena wanted to die. A flicker of amusement crossed his gaze, but before he could respond, a suited man stepped up beside him, one who looked suspiciously like security. "Mr. Hale, is everything all right?" Elena froze. Hale. The name sent alarm bells ringing in her head. She had heard it before. Sebastian Hale. Her stomach dropped. One of the most powerful financial moguls in the country. A billionaire whose name was whispered in corporate boardrooms, a man who rarely made public appearances. He thrived in the shadows, pulling strings behind the scenes, and he despised unnecessary attention. And she had just thrown herself at him. Her pulse pounded. Oh no. Sebastian seemed to notice the wave of realization wash over her, because that smirk, 100% arrogant, finally appeared. "You look nervous," he observed, arms crossing. Elena blinked rapidly. "I'm afraid of embarrassing mistakes being caught on security cameras and ending up on the internet." His gaze flicked toward his security guard before returning to her. Understandable. Panic crawled up her spine. Was there already footage of this? What if someone had been filming? What if this ended up online? "I need to find my friend," she muttered, voice barely above a whisper. She turned to leave, but she could still feel his eyes on her, prickling against her skin. And somehow, she knew. He wasn't just going to let her disappear into the crowd. Hours later, Elena was back at work, standing behind the counter at the airport cafe. She had managed to push the humiliating encounter to the back of her mind, mostly, until the bell above the door chimed. Her breath caught in her throat. Sebastian Hale had just walked in. She blinked. No, this cannot be happening. He spotted her instantly, his storm-gray gaze locking onto hers with sharp precision. He strolled toward the counter, moving with an effortless confidence that made her stomach twist. He leaned forward slightly. "A coffee," he said, "but I want it made by you." She narrowed her eyes. He did not just say that. This was going to be a problem.